Hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen Woodward. I'm director of the Simpson Center for the Humanities. Welcome. Very happy to see all of you here. Each year, the executive board of the Simpson Center selects one person from our own faculty to receive the honor of being named the Katz Distinguished Lecturer. I'm exceptionally pleased. Our Katz Lecturer for 2023-24 is Sasha Welland, Chair and Professor of our outstanding Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. The Katz Lectures constitute our highest public tribute to scholarly work in the humanities, and as many of you here know, Solomon Katz was a scholar of Byzantine history that served as chair of our Department of History, as well as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. He was an admired and beloved leader at our university, and so is Sasha. Allow me to thank Shirley Yee, who nominated Sasha for this award, and the brilliant staff of the Simpson Center, Rachel Artiaga, Julie Stovering, Yassi Naragi, Emily Bryant, Shelby House, and especially Caitlin Halo, who is right here, for bringing us together. One of the purposes of the Katz Lectures is to illuminate new ways of knowing and new ways of being in a scholarly and academic world. In this, Sasha is exemplary, one of our most creative faculty members, leading us and herself in new and unexpected directions, drawing on visual culture, ethnography, feminist thought, and global geographies, and drawing them and us together. She's the author of 2 books, one a biography of the remarkable lives of 2 Chinese modern girls, the other book entitled Experimental Beijing, Gender and Globalization, an ethnography of contemporary Chinese art, feminist art, that is supplemented by a companion of digital images, an early and ambitious, completely ambitious experiment in creating a digital archive that is multilingual. These are stellar accomplishments, but I also want to pay tribute to intangible qualities of herself and of her work. Her commitments are deep and bring ideas, feelings, objects, and subjects into the light. There is a quality of luminosity in her work. She possesses an intrepid integrity, an aesthetic spirit, and a generous way of entangling us in her projects. I'm thinking of the project she organized several years ago with support from the Simpson Center on ethnographic aesthetics. What does that mean, ethnographic aesthetics? Imagine anthropologists moving into the world of poetry. Imagine anthropologists reinventing ethnographic documentary through a focus on sensory experience. She brought artists who worked in these new modes to the University of Washington, enriching us all. And this also is a characteristic of her own work. Collaboration is for her an ethical practice, which brings us to her research on cancer aesthetics, to violence that is cancerous, to grief, to research rooted in St. Louis, a site of nuclear waste. We'll also travel tonight to other geographical sites, for her work in St. Louis resonates with that of 2 other wonderful faculty at the University of Washington, Holly Barker and Shannon Cram. After Sasha's talk, running some 40 minutes, they'll join her to address foundational questions, after which we'll open this up to Q&A. A word or two. Shannon Cram is assistant professor in interdisciplinary arts and sciences at UW-Bothell and the author of a certain-to-be prize-winning book, Unmaking the Bomb, Environmental Cleanup and the Politics of Impossibility. Her site is Hanford. Established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, the Hanford site in southeastern Washington state produced plutonium for thousands of atomic weapons, including the bomb detonated in Nagasaki. Hanford is now home to some 2/3 of the nation's high-level radioactive waste. For 10 years, Shannon Cram served on the Hanford Advisory Board, which provides policy advice about cleanup to the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Holly Barker is teaching professor of anthropology and curator of oceanic and Asian culture at the Burke Museum and the author of the book, Bravo for the Marshallese, Regaining Control in a Post-Nuclear, Post-Colonial World. Her site is the Marshall Islands. From 46 to 58, the US government tested 67 atomic and nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. She has worked for decades with the Marshallese community, and in 2018, the president of the Marshall Islands appointed her commissioner to the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I'm in admiration of these three extraordinary women. Together, they deepen our knowledge of three different geographical sites that are sites of toxicity and are linked together. I'm prompted to think about our own place, our own site, although it's by no means perfectly analogous, not at all, but there is a connection. We need to remember that the University of Washington stands on the land of the Coast Salish people, land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, land which remains unceded. Sasha Welland's talk for us tonight is entitled The Art of Living in the Nuclear Anthropocene. Wonderful to have you here.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Thanks so much for being here. Thank you to Kathy for such a thoughtful and thought-provoking introduction. And especially thank you to Holly and Shannon for being in conversation with me tonight and calming my nerves. It's really an honor and a joy to think together with them as scholars and community activists who have much deeper experience in this realm than I do. I stand here with a lot of humility because I arrived at the story I'm about to tell you both by accident and by necessity. That means there are a lot of unresolved tensions and thoughts I haven't really fully worked out that remain. It also means I'm deeply indebted to a lot of friends and fellow thinkers, some of who are here tonight, thank you, who have helped me stay alive in this story for many years now. Some strands are woven in through the slides that I'll show, which is a parallel visual essay. And these essays together, essays as like an attempt, a try, they're trying to tell a terrible and also tender story in which no body becomes a statistical person, through which we might imagine reparative and connective work in the future. So the overarching frame for tonight is the art of life, of living in the nuclear Anthropocene. But I'm going to begin with an essay. And first, one final thanks to Ellen O'Hara-Slavic, who kindly let us use her artwork for the poster and for the event tonight, and whose work, once I was sitting with it and thinking about this, I decided to weave throughout the visual essay together with some other artists. So the essay I'm going to read and present as my piece of the conversation is titled In Flight. August 2019, almost exactly 10 years after my sister's death, I'm flying home to the city I had forsaken long before. I rest my head against the dull white curve of a pressurized interior. Eyes closed, I lean into the familiar loop, where she's there. Magic hour light bouncing off her face as she glances backward, and then she's gone again. As we begin our descent, the interchange of I-70 and I-170 comes into sight. Down there, in a scene too distant to be seen by the untrained eye above, Cara and I once circled the corral on ponies stabled in highway shadow, inhaling manure and jet fuel. We drove the kiddie cars at Holiday Hill, its weekend amusements paved under new runways long ago. We grew up steeped in the sanitized lore of our hometown as a place to provision for departure, where a barnstormer named Charles Lindbergh went from flying a mail route to piloting the first solo transatlantic flight in the spirit of St. Louis. Every trip to the Gateway Arch downtown began underground, beneath that shiny paean of modern engineering yearning skyward. The spotlit cave of the Museum of Westward Expansion beckoned, like an amusement park ride, pitching from one fabricated scene to another. It opened when I was 7 in the bicentennial year of 1976. It closed in 2015, a year after the Ferguson police shooting of Michael Brown ignited Black Lives Matter. It closed for renovations that pledged to see history differently. But the version I remember told the story of the settlers push west, propped up by dioramas of taxidermy beavers and bears, covered wagons and log cabins, stripped of the violence of conquest and dispossession that had cleared the land for this history's imposition upon it. A film documenting the monument's construction, scored with orchestral notes and near biblical voiceover. In this place, for our time, a great and simple arch did seem right. Played in a loop in the theater. It left out all that was not right. For example, July 14, 1964, the day Percy Green and John Daly, Congress of Racial Equality activists, climbed halfway up the unfinished north leg to protest that no Black workers had been hired for the massive federally funded project. The two men remained suspended 125 feet above the city for 5 hours before their arrest. After the arch opened to the public, we would wait in the line that switched back and forth down to the elevator loading area. When the doors to our capsule slid open, an otherworldly glow spilled out. White plastic seats, illuminated by a ring of blue light, promised to transport us to the future. We crowded in, and modernity rocked us upward, inside a stainless steel sheathed leg of the Gateway Arch. The arch was built on 37 riverfront blocks on the western bank of the Mississippi, once the urban center of Black and Bohemian St. Louis, demolished in 1939 on the promise of national park funds for the monument's development. Amid the plans considered during the 25 years that the area then lay fallow was the construction of a bomb shelter large enough to hold all the city's residents. Chastened by the spirit of St. Louis, I moved west after high school and didn't look back. Until my sister Cara, who stayed, found a lump in her armpit. Then I repeatedly flew back through the 6 years of her struggle with cancer and the rigors of its treatment. I flew back in 2009 to accompany her through the final weeks and days of life in a way station apartment across the street from Barnes Jewish Hospital at the verdant edge of Forest Park, where we would scatter her ashes at the base of a ginkgo tree by the skating rink where she once flew with breathtaking speed across the ice. I never really looked back, though, not in terms of where we come from and its indelible marks upon us. I only began that journey a decade after her departure, after I learned about a cancer cluster near the house where I'd waited in a borrowed playpen in a black and white tiled kitchen for my parents to carry a baby sister through the back door home from the hospital. March 2016, my brother-in-law, this kinship term more archaic than ever in its afterlife, sends me a text. Do you know about this? The blinking ellipsis that follows resolves into a link to a local news report. As I watched the TV segment on my phone, I learned that residents of Florissant in St. Louis County had started noticing an unusually high number of cancers among neighbors and former high school classmates. They began sharing information over Facebook. Their efforts uncovered a history of radioactive waste in nearby creeks, ball fields, and landfills. Under a 25-year Manhattan Project government contract, a local company, Mallinckrodt Chemical Works, purified uranium ore for the atomic bombs the US dropped on Japan at the end of World War II, and then for the nation's Cold War arsenal. Throughout the middle of the 20th century, a largely secret collusion of public and private military industrial interests strewed mismanaged waste throughout the growing area of North St. Louis County. In the same year of this unearthing of the past, white police officer Darren Wilson shot and killed 18-year-old Michael Brown on August 9th, 2014, in the middle of the day, in the middle of Canfield Drive, in the city of Ferguson, immediately south of Florissant. A parallel history of possessive investment in white supremacy structured this deadly instance of state violence, a history punctuated by legally enforced residential segregation, federal housing loan bias, white real estate and wealth accumulation, corporate tax relief, and armed force tasked with generating municipal revenue by policing those most dispossessed by these structures. This history is especially blatant in St. Louis, as it gradually went from one of the least to one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Residential zoning to keep certain neighborhoods white produced the patchwork map of St. Louis County with its 90 separate municipalities. In the 1960s, middle-class Ferguson was a white sundown town. Black workers who came in from neighboring Kinloch were banned after nightfall. As Black homeowners challenged racist housing covenants and as rental units were built to accommodate families displaced by demolished public housing downtown, demographics shifted. By the 1990s, Ferguson had become majority Black, even though the police remained overwhelmingly white. When they left Michael Brown's body in the street on a hot summer day for 4 hours after his death, what was exceptional is what happened next. The outrage on Canfield Drive grew into a national and international movement. In that same year of mounting Black Lives Matter activism, Florissant community members, alarmed by the high incidence of illness, created their first crowdsourced map tracking autoimmune disease, appendix cancer, brain tumors, thyroid conditions, and total cancers. The group named themselves after Coldwater Creek, a tributary of the Mississippi called Rivière de l'Eau Froide by early French colonists. Centuries later, radioactive waste seeping into its water, the creek wends its way through North County, oblivious to municipal divisions. These contaminated histories of harm plume outward, across boundaries engineered to separate and contain, to hold together these parallel forms of protest against fast death caused by racist and militarized policing and slow death caused by classified military scientific industrial disregard, means moving beyond individuated grief to recognition of the entangled terrors of racial capitalism and nuclear colonialism that produce everyday carcinogenic relations. Embodied ecologies bleed into one another, although the depth of their confluence was far from apparent to me when I first learned about the Coldwater Creek Health Survey and completed it for Cara in her absence. I completed it for Cara because she is why I've kept writing this essay for more than a decade. It's my way of staying with her. To glance back at our youthful glow, filtered through everything that has happened since, is an act of hope. This is me trying to tell you how my sister got sick, how I lost her slowly and then all at once, and how I keep trying to follow behind, assembling a trail of clues, feeling as if I could only piece them together, I would bring her back to health. Or if not her, then some version of her in the future. This is a story of staying with the trouble, instead of believing we can cut it out or secure ourselves from it. Instead, the task is to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. Staying with Cara is a story of unexpectedly falling into the world and coming up somewhere I could never have predicted. She is the reason I keep writing, because writing by nature invites us to consider the possibility that the world can, in fact, be different, because it is through that rectangular artifact we call a book that we communicate with our dead, and all of the dead are our dead. Every community is saturated in one way or another. The Nuclear Anthropocene, the geologic era of human influence blasted open by the first atomic explosion, can be assessed by the concentration of strontium-90 left in the teeth and bones of those who lived through the decades of US atmospheric nuclear testing, or by the level of carbon-14 in the paint binder of artworks produced in this period. Mid-century bodies and counterfeit paintings alike can be dated by chemical exposure, even if public consciousness, managed by actuarial science of acceptable risk, denies the consequences of the data. A health physicist for the US Army Corps of Engineers once tried to assuage North County residents' concerns about radioactive waste with the data from the lifespan study of Hibakusha, survivors of the US nuclear bombs detonated above Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Is there a connection between Cara's illness, which never failed to confound the panel of oncologists who consulted on her case, and this legacy of waste? Whenever I present the postmortem details, this is the question that arises, the one I cannot answer. What it would take, epidemiologically speaking, to construct an evidence-based argument for the particulars of her case seems unsurmountable, especially given the decades of research and organization it has taken just to raise awareness about generalized community risk. And yet, is a direct connection necessary? The proximity of her life and death to this larger story, Kara's dot on the map, making one family's loss among many left searching for answers, seems enough to compel a sustained look back at the ways we are entangled with the places from which we might think we can flee. Why did no one in my family or any of Kara's doctors know about the history lying out in the open, not far from where we once lived? How far a stretch would it be to consider Kara a Hibachka in its expanded definition that includes all communities impacted by the legacy of the nuclear industry through bombing, testing, mining, and processing, through fallout, accidents, and uncontained waste? At Jefferson Elementary, our teacher paused whenever a plane flew overhead. The flight pattern of aircraft to and from St. Louis Lambert International, built on the historically Black city of Kinloch, regularly rattled the windows of our Public Works Administration schoolhouse. The hum of 747s and DC-9s overlaid with disco synth shaped our subconscious soundtrack. When my sister was a baby, my father and I would drive on Sunday mornings to a parking lot near Lambert Airport to watch airplanes take off and land. On the hood of a Buick Skylark shimmering pale green, we watched from our perch, like air traffic control, the flash of silver, birds on the tarmac below. A string of Sundays waiting for what the horizon would bring became our ritual, church of wonder, faith in the future, followed by communion at the International House of Pancakes. My father, the young mathematician, points to incoming planes, calculating trajectories, an asymptote that approaches but never touches the ground. His black framed glasses in the early autumn sun, solid as an equation that seeks to balance one side with the other. I nestle in that memory of security in a jeans jacket with a woolly collar against my father's side. Science and technology were his creed until the end, when their failure to save his youngest brought him down hard to the ground. Flying in 2019 toward the city I had forsaken, once out of youthful ambition and later in middle-aged grief, I busied myself with preparations for this visit. I listened to a podcast on K-Drive, early whistleblower and unrelenting public voice on radioactive waste in St. Louis. I underlined key passages in Lisa Martino-Taylor's Behind the Fog, which traces the US Cold War weapons program in and out of St. Louis. Collating documentation of tracer experiments run by the US Army Chemical Corps in the 1950s and 60s, together with the activities of Atomic Energy Commission officers, scientists, and contractors, she provides evidence of an embedded radiological weapons study conducted on unwitting civilians. The areas targeted for experimental spraying of chemical particles were primarily Black census tracts and public housing towers downtown. During my week in St. Louis, I would be meeting with Dry and Martino Taylor, as well as the co-organizers of Just Moms STL, founded in 2014 to expose the effects of radioactive waste dumped in a landfill near their homes. In the seat next to me on the airplane, a woman with short salt and pepper hair fastidiously arranged herself, careful not to cross our shared armrest. When she got up mid-flight to use the lavatory, her husband eagerly leaned over, gesturing toward the book on my open on my tray table. "You're a student?" he half asked, half asserted. I mumbled something about doing research, that I was originally from St. Louis and heading back for work. He was headed home too, he said, but that was now as far away as he could get from the city. "You know, there's shootings almost every day. There's the Arch, the Hill, all those beautiful old brick buildings, but it's not worth going there anymore." He collapsed a century of racist urban planning into a coded throwaway sentence. When he asked what I was researching, I strung together the Manhattan Project, Mallinckrodt, nuclear waste. He told me he knew all about this. With barely suppressed Cold War glee, he cried out, "Hot stuff." I was so unnerved, I didn't think to ask how or what he knew. Instead, relief sank in as I watched his wife come back up the aisle, knowing that our mutual silence would soon be reassured. The heady mix of patriotism and patriarchy in those two syllables seemed intended to put me in my place. The glib ease of Manhattan Project code names, special stuff for radioactive isotopes, gadget for the Trinity test. Little Boy and Fat Man for the bombs deployed over Japan conferred confidence and insider status to those who bantered them about. I gazed out the window at the flooded landscape coming into view below, where recent weather had caused record high river levels and catastrophic crop loss. St. Louis sits at a confluence of rivers. The Illinois and Missouri rivers feed into the Mississippi. Smaller tributaries like Coldwater Creek, which curves through North County and underneath the airport and the culvert, connect to the larger system. When the waters rise, creeks flood, fields flood, basements flood. My parents arrived in St. Louis in the early 1970s when my father took a job in the math department at the University of Missouri's new urban campus. My Chinese American mother moved to the neighborhood at the height of the Vietnam War. Memories from those years of the hidden landmines of everyday life still bristle. At the grocery store, a white-haired woman, pocketbook raised in one hand, comes down the aisle hissing, "Go home." Or one evening when my mother pulls into the local gas station, the attendant sees her alone behind the windshield of our VW van and alerts the police of a suspected car theft. UMSL, the university where my father worked, was built atop a former country club amid the North County municipalities of Normandy, Belle Noire, Belle Ridge, Berkeley, and Ferguson. Just to the west, Lambert Field had served as the base for McDonnell aircraft since World War II. After merging with Douglas Aircraft in 1967, corporate engineers developed commercial jetliners alongside military planes. As a Cold War defense contractor, the company became for a time the world's largest producer of fighter jets. Its leadership also terminated Percy Green from his job there after his participation in core activism, including the Gateway Arch protest. Green had been a technician on Project Mercury, the first US spaceflight program, which aimed to beat the Soviet Union at putting a man into orbit. My father gradually shifted his focus from harmonic analysis, the mathematical procedure for describing phenomena of a recurrent nature like sound waves, electric current, and tides, to applied forms of inquiry. He collaborated with researchers at McDonnell Douglas to launch graduate programs that prepared students to enter local industries fueled by government contracts. The winged shadows of their inventions swept over this flat parcel of America's heartland. Osage territory transferred in an 1825 treaty directly to the head of the American Fur Company, cleared into tree-lined family farms, and eventually belted by interstates designed to shuttle white workers between the suburbs and downtown. Here, my family's fate became entangled with a history of bombing. We held the lethal payload of Skyhawk, Phantom, Banshee, Voodoo, Demon at bay with the up, up, and away jingle of Trans World Airlines, which promised we could be at the center of things. Encased within riveted aluminum skin, we grew accustomed to surveying expanses of cloud, land, and water out of small oval windows. The ethereal high-altitude slant of light glanced over seats upholstered in warm tones. Strangers jostled amid the smell of burnt coffee and bursts of cigarette ash released by the flick of a child fidgeting with the lid of the metal ashtray in her armrest. On August 6, 1945, 3 B-29s flew in formation over Hiroshima. As John Hershey observes in his devastating reportage, the Japanese had taken to referring to this class of bombers as B-san, or Mr. B, with a mixture of respect and unhappy familiarity. The Americans also personified their machines with a lethal mixture of Freudian attachment, showmanship, and desire. The Enola Gay, named after the mother of one of its co-pilots, carried within its belly Little Boy, code name for the first atomic bomb used in warfare. 2 observation planes, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil, accompanied the loaded mothership. Painted on the silver nose of the first, a mustachioed, tuxedo-clad entertainer steps out. Clasping a top hat in one hand, he extends the other in a magician's ta-da. His counterpart is a buxom blonde. She stands top-heavy, tiny feet stuffed into green high heels and a strapless 2-piece bathing suit, although she would only be painted below the cockpit window of Necessary Evil hours before her Nagasaki mission 3 days later. Her costume wouldn't be called a bikini until a French designer named his version of the fashion after the Bikini Atoll atomic bomb test in the Pacific that decimated the lives of Marshall Islanders the following year. The Great Artiste's crew included 3 scientific observers. Immediately after the Enola Gay's bomb doors opened, they released 3 canisters equipped with pressure wave detectors designed by Caltech physicists.
They floated on parachutes into the bomb zone, transmitting signals back to onboard receivers. Necessary Evil carried soldiers with cameras. They captured the iconic aerial photographs of the mushroom cloud. Superimposed over the concentric circles of the target, the wide-eyed blonde poses. Her legs straddle a fissured red and yellow rising sun flag as if it were a beach blanket. At her feet, wisps of black smoke rise from the silhouette of a smoldering city, and the exclamation of hot stuff, a pinup girl, teeters at the semantic precipice of radioactive waste. The last surviving crew member of the three planes expressed no regret at the age of 95. He stated innocence in knowledge, if not deed. Quote, "We were only told what we needed to know and keep your mouth shut," end quote. From the air, the spectacular cloud they'd explicitly been told not to fly through blanketed the devastation below. It is no mistake that unearthly images of cloud and smoke circulated widely in the US media, and that those of flash-burned bodies, young and old, amid a ruined cityscape did not. In the stagey gesture of an entertainer with a top hat, Hiroshima's dead, estimated anywhere between 70,000 and 140,000, disappeared from view. The numbers are hard to reckon. Bodies in the hypocenter were vaporized. Those of burn victims washed out to sea when they jumped into rivers. Others died months or years later from cancer. Yet the unfathomable physical destruction wrought by the bombs entered the public imagination to the extent that in 1959, when bulldozers cleared another 100 square blocks of downtown St. Louis, home to 20,000 people, 95% Black, former residents nicknamed the devastated landscape Hiroshima Flats. In June 1978, a Catholic nun and a nuclear physicist sat next to each other on an airplane departing New York City. The 1970s had been declared the disarmament decade by the United Nations, and Mary Ann McGivern, a member of the Sisters of Laredo, was on her way home to St. Louis after attending the UN's first special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament. The document produced from this 5-week session opens with alarm at the very threat to the very survival of mankind. Of the 149 member nations that sent delegates, the third world majority pushed for the end of nuclear competition, demanding that funds gained from military reduction be committed to economic and social development. Their stance resonated with that of representatives, including Sister McGivern, from the 230 non-governmental organizations in attendance. As a co-founder of a Catholic worker shelter for women and children in North St. Louis, she had taken a vow of poverty and dedicated herself to economic conversion. This principle asserted that disarmament required reinvestment in communities and workers as they moved away from dependence on defense industries. McGivern's efforts involved documenting the flow of money into St. Louis through government contracts with companies like Mallinckrodt, Monsanto, and McDonnell Douglas. The argument for economic conversion updated Isaiah 2:4, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares, their spears into sickles. At the gates of the UN, peace activists held a vigil every day at noon throughout the special session. On its closing day, they delivered a loaf of bread to each delegation, a rebuke to the compromises they had made. The only result of the groundbreaking meeting was a non-binding program of recommendations. On her flight out of New York, Mary Ann McGivern tried to focus on her book, but she sat next to a man immersed in an array of papers. She noticed maps and then a document titled Nuclear Tailings. As she later recalled, she took advantage of his break in concentration when the stewardess served their lunch trays, casually venturing, "I see you are studying material about nuclear tailings." When he nodded, she, quote, cast her bread upon the waters, end quote, and told him she was on her way home from the disarmament session. He was traveling, he explained, to testify before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission against uranium mining on Indian lands. The anti-nuclear nun's seatmate was Robert O. Cole, a physicist from Cornell, whose research interests included nuclear waste disposal, reactor decommissioning, and radiation health effects. At the time of their encounter, he served on an nuclear advisory council to President Carter. His published reports from the late 1970s include environmental statements on uranium mining in Wyoming and within the 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo Diné Nation at the juncture of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. When Cole said, "I suppose you're active in opposing your nuclear waste dump," McGivern responded with a blank look. Surprised, he told her about a government agency study he'd recently read on radon gas emissions at a St. Louis waste site. He had assumed it was public knowledge. Since the study wasn't classified, he promised to send her a copy. During the US military occupation of Japan, a ban in both countries suppressed photographs that depicted civilian suffering. Documentary images taken by troops on the ground were turned over as classified intelligence. In 1946, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission began studying the after effects of radiation exposure. The medical data that continues to be gathered from those who initially survived, as well as their descendants, makes up the lifespan study of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, still one of the main, if contested, sources of data used for evaluating the risks of radiation exposure. Yet for decades, censorship of this information prevailed. The first time Carl lost her hair to chemotherapy, she covered her bald head with a wig. Until one spring day out gardening, it got hot and itchy. She tossed it on a tree branch where it hung like the remains of a gutted animal and never put it on again. When a final aggressive surgery, a double mastectomy accompanied by resection of several tumors from her back, left a wound at the base of her neck that refused to heal, she began taking selfies. She took the same frame again and again. In the first photograph, a rectangle of gauze is taped over the area. The camera's flash illuminates her scalp, mostly bald, except for a few stringy patches of hair that haven't fallen out yet. The next image is more tightly framed. The gauze has been removed to reveal a deep eye-shaped wound, pink and puffy around its edges, vacuous and pus-filled at its center. Back home, Sister McGivern started asking around, but no one seemed to know anything about a nuclear dump. Within days, a letter from Cornell arrived, together with a report on Laddie Avenue in St. Louis's North County. Pohl wrote, "Well, it's not right in St. Louis, but probably close enough to merit some attention. Let me know what you decide to do." McGivern found the location on a city map. Laddie was a dead-end street northeast of the airport. On a bright June day, she drove out there with her friend Barbara Kaur, a former Chinese literature professor at Washington University, who had also participated in the daily vigils at the UN special session. 6 years earlier, Kaur and 4 other faculty members involved in anti-Vietnam War activism had shown up uninvited at a McDonnell Douglas board meeting. A campus referendum had named them as representatives to vote the university's 34,000 shares in the company against its production of Phantom II fighter jets. Those corporate headquarters lay just a few miles from where the 2 women now found themselves. McGivern remembers, at the end of Laddie, at the railroad tracks, we got out and hiked to the back of the site to look for the creek described in the paper. There was a prefab office and a warehouse and a parking lot. It was silent. No hum of insects, no birds, no warning signs, no sign of anything radioactive except the silence. Standing in the field, we got scared, deeply frightened at what we couldn't see or hear or smell. Several months later, she sent a letter to 2 local environmentalists, Kay Dry and Susan Flatter. "Dear Kay and Susan, I met Robert Pohl on the airplane and he sent me this material. Barbara Kaur and I found the site. It is unmarked, unfenced, has construction going on, and is right next to some trucking companies. Sunflowers bloom galore, but there are no crickets or other animal sounds. There were such sounds in other nearby fields. Here's what I think needs to be done. Find a physicist or 2 to explain what all the data means. Tell management and union stewards about the radiation danger. Longer range, is there a higher than average incidence of leukemia, bone and lung cancer in the 2-mile area than in the standard metropolitan statistical area of St. Louis? Also, the paper seems to imply other waste disposal sites and sites where nuclear material has been processed. Where are these sites? Finally, tell the press and residents about the site. Who owns it? What protection do we have that it won't be used for work or housing a few hundred years from now?" Mary Ann McGivern. The chance in-flight encounter behind this letter led to a chain of events that continues to drive local activism. Kay Dry produced a copy of the letter in her basement archive for me to photograph. Before that, I had spent days in the basement of UMSL's Thomas Jefferson Library, beginning to understand the dogged extent of her work. I had called up only a selection of boxes from the scores that constitute the Kay Dry collections, just feet from what was once the campus swimming pool, where I'd spent long, hot summer days as a kid. I sat in the air-conditioned chill, poring over government reports, environmental impact statements, epidemiological studies, groundwater maps, lists of names and numbers of people to contact, newspaper clippings, interviews with residents and workers about lost sites, and letters to journalists, scientists, city board members, and state and federal officials. What they discovered at Laddie Avenue was a public secret, what Kay Dry would come to call with caustic enthusiasm, the oldest nuclear waste in the nation. The uranium-235 purified by Mallinckrodt in their downtown Destrehan Street plant fueled the little boy bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Shipped to the Hanford nuclear reservation in Washington state for conversion into plutonium, it contributed to the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. With a contract that extended well beyond wartime exigency, Mallinckrodt's processing business thrived through the Cold War. Kay Kranzberg Dry would dedicate the next 4 decades to what became her life's work, to research, uncover, and lobby for the removal of radioactive waste in St. Louis. She pressed politicians and government agencies to acknowledge and address the danger created in the name of security, buried in their backyards and deeply entangled with regional race and class politics. Dry's red brick house in the University City neighborhood grew into a voluminous atomic archive where she honed her mobilization skills and her joke about being the world's best filing clerk. The basement, nicknamed Down Under, like a nuclear submarine, and protected by action figures of St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes, housed rows of filing cabinets. The dining room table, presided over by a phalanx of her spirit animal, the slow but steady sloth, and all the fuzzy, stuffed, drawn, and painted forms that had been gifted to her over the years, provided a gathering point for citizen activists to research and organize. Against all the forces arrayed against them of secrecy, administrative avoidance, industrial whitewashing, and federal, state, city, county, and municipal divisions, these organizers continue to bring a buried history to the surface. Some of the most vocal and stubborn participants in this cross-generational effort have been women, whose largely unpaid expert knowledge also exposes the gendered division of labor between the patriarchal nature of political, military, scientific, nuclear networks, and the care work of women on behalf of communities and families as they support those who are sick and sustain campaigns coordinating research and documentation and demanding remediation and compensation. They have shown through phone call after phone call, FOIA request after FOIA request, community meeting after community meeting, the bad bill of sale we've been handed, in which the transactions of nuclear colonialism and dispersal of its materiality throughout St. Louis and beyond revealed sides to an equation that in every instance is impossible to balance. In 1946, the Manhattan Project purchased a 21.7-acre tract of land on the northern edge of Lambert Airport to store residues from uranium processing at the downtown Mallinckrodt plant. In the acronym-laden language of the formerly utilized site's remedial action program, or FUSRAP, run by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to address environmental hazards caused by the Manhattan Project or Atomic Energy Commission activities, this storage area became known as SLAPS, the St. Louis Airport site. Kay Dry led a 20-year campaign to have the Department of Energy acknowledge and remove the waste. A second storage site with a more convoluted history involving private purchase of waste, partial removal, and illegal dumping in nearby Westlake landfill is located on Laddie Avenue, as indicated in the report Robert Pohl sent to Marianne Given. Coldwater Creek abuts both the SLAPS and Laddie sites, running through residential streets and a green belt of neighborhood parks, transporting contaminated water through interconnected underground caves, springs, and groundwater tables. The landfill, designated an EPA Superfund site in 1990, received little attention for over 2 decades until Just Moms STL founders Karen Nickel and Don Chapman joined forces. They connected after noticing a noxious odor coming from the landfill, and then through a phone call about it to a local authority, learned by chance the history of nuclear dumping at the site. Bulldozers had churned the radioactive material underneath, leaving it in disparate pockets that one environmentalist described to me as chocolate chips suspended in cookie dough. Planes heading to the airport routinely pass over the 200-acre site, which lies cloaked in gravel, green surface tarps, and a hissing tangle of black methane pump tubes. In addition to chemical waste from Mallinckrodt and Monsanto, uncovered through community research into waste management records, the landfill likely also contains demolished ruins from Pruitt-Igoe, the infamously imploded St. Louis urban housing project that served as a secret test target for the military's radiological weapons program. The humble language of just moms belies the fierce know-how of Chapman, Nichols, and all their supporters and allies who have held the EPA to the fire for leaving them to, quote unquote, babysit the landfill. While the mythology of St. Louis may be as a place to provision for departure, these women demonstrate what it means to stay put and stay with the trouble. As the crew of my plane prepares for landing, I consider this single instance of the nuclear Anthropocene that hits so close to home. I think about it as measured against some ghostly floodline. So many forces colluded to suppress public knowledge of the events that led Mary Ann McGivern and Barbara Core to stand in a field on a summer day and shiver at what they couldn't see or hear or smell. The Coldwater Creek Community Group had no idea what they would uncover when they first formed over Facebook. They were as unwitting in 2011 as McGivern had been in 1978. Kay Dry led decades of organizing and launched an investigative team of 5 St. Louis Post-Dispatch journalists who spent 2 years interviewing over 200 people and published a special report in 1989 that comprised full-page spreads over a full week. Still, of what had long been buried throughout North County remained just below the surface. Sometimes it rose into sight before being submerged once again. By the time I had the opportunity to meet Dry, dementia had led her to repeat key phrases and stories. Her intense drive intact, she repeatedly asked me, because this is what she had learned it would take to counteract cultural amnesia. Now, what is your angle? As we near the runway, I search the ground for scattered tombstones and plastic flowers, which, depending on the approach, might appear right before we touch down. Washington Park Cemetery, founded in 1920 under Jim Crow segregation laws, was once the largest Black cemetery in St. Louis. On weekends, families traveled past city limits and through its colonnade of ginkgo and tulip trees to picnic with kin in what was advertised as a lovely garden spot where naught of woe obtrudes its melancholy. In the late 1950s, construction of I-70 cut across its carefully tended acres. In the 1970s, airport development claimed 9 more acres. I only learned this history in the 1990s when a new plan for runway expansion and extension of the light rail encroached again. Over the course of these projects, workers removed over 10,000 graves and relocated remains to 23 vicinity cemeteries. Mismanagement of records has stranded the dead from families who can no longer find them. While the depleted remains of Little Boy were trucked to storage sites north of the airport, the bodies of those laid to rest on its eastern edge were dug up and dispersed to grounds unknown. The evacuation of slabs took 9 years, during which 600,000 cubic yards of radiologically contaminated materials were shipped to a licensed out-of-state disposal facility. An innocuous carpet of grass bounded by McDonald Boulevard and Banshee Road now covers the site. Touching ground at St. Louis Lambert International, its gateway promise of progress, modernity, and flight built upon the accumulated wreckage of the 20th century is always as much transgression as homecoming. A McDonnell Douglas patch issued to US Air Force test pilots layers together this history with chilling efficiency. Below the names of its fighter jets, Phantom, Banshee, Voodoo, Demon, Phantom II, F-15, the apotheosis of St. Louis, sword raised upside down to form a cross, drives through the gateway arch on the back of an armor-clad steed. A gift to the city from the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company, the statue of Louis IX, stitched in blood red, floats over a white mushroom cloud that billows against a sky of pale blue thread. The motto below reads, "The spirits move us." Someone cut this patch from a white nylon flight suit and put it up for sale on eBay. It arrived at my doorstep in a nondescript envelope. It has been on my doorstep all along, as has been a history of kinsfolk tending stones amid desecration, of nuns tying yellow ribbons to the fence around a contaminated landfill, of physicists testifying against uranium mining, of mothers waking up to what was buried in their backyard and seeking justice. These are the spirits that move me as I touch ground, asking what it would take to name and redeem each of the forsaken lives gathered here. There's a snapshot that I love of my sister mid-flight in the window seat, her tray table down with a sparkling glass of soda and a packet of pretzels on top. The oval windows behind her glow with an ethereal high-altitude slant of light illuminating the top of her head as she leans over the armrest and smiles from beneath neatly trimmed things. I'm not quite sure where we're headed, but she's right here.